Let me continue to read the biography of Isaiah Berlin, titled A Life. The author is Michael Ignatieff. Chapter 2. His memory of his birthplace was framed by two Sphinx standing guard at the entrance to the Arbor Street apartment. Reclining plaster figures with paws, breasts, and a pariah's headdress. They are still there, mossy with damp and chipped with age, guarding the entrance to the Art Nouveau apartment block where he was born, on the fourth floor, on the 6th June 1909. In his parents' bed, in all likelihood, with a German doctor and a nurse in attendance, his father pacing up and down the parquet outside, chloroform oozing beneath the door. He may have been lucky to survive. After many hours of labor, the German doctor delivering the child. Do you want his name? It was a H. Placed the forceps on the infant's left arm, and yanked him into the world so violently that the ligaments were permanently damaged. Isaiah was not the firstborn. His mother had had a stillbirth in 1907 and been told she would never be able to have children again. His parents greeted his arrival with the astonishment reserved for miracles. These facts, the stillborn sister, the longed-for realization of his parents' wishes, the injury at birth, an only child, are vitally important, though interpreting their significance is not easy. He himself never liked taken as an oblique fable about his own beginnings. It is the story of Hannah, the barren woman who goes to the temple to pray for a son, and who is so distraught that the high priest takes her for mad. And she was in bitterness of soul, and prayed unto the Lord, and wept sore. In her desperation, Hannah promised that if God would grant her a son, she would give him into his service. Her faith, her primitive, intense desire for a child, was eventually rewarded. She and her husband Elkanah had a child who grew up to become the prophet Samuel, Isaiah's father. Musa Marie Berlin was intensely moved by these verses and by the promise of hope that they contained, for they spoke so directly to her own desperation. Having lost one child, having been told she would never give birth again, she was at the relatively advanced age of 29 when her deliverance came. It is easy to see why. Whenever Berlin himself brought to mind the desperate faith of Hannah, his eyes would fill with tears. Tears came easily when watching a film or when quoting the Gettysburg Address. But for all that, he paid close attention to his own emotional truth. Toward his mother's memory, he maintained something like awe at her strength of character, mixed with irritation at the tidal force of her claim upon him. Towards Riga, he maintained something close to indifference, too far back, perhaps, or too Latvian. These were little nostalgia in him, and despite being an exile, no obvious sense of loss. Nursery rhymes and popular songs from his childhood came back at his bidding, and he sang them cheerfully in a musical whisper. But there wasn't much that he seemed to grieve for. The past did not make painful claims. The first 6 years of his life were spent in the apartment on the Albert Street. His Latvian governess, his Latvian governess would take him out on leading strings between the Phoenix down the street to the public garden, grandly called the Esplanade, where Crimean veterans sunned themselves and relived Inkerman and Sevastopol. Riga was then the capital of Livonia, a province of the Tsarist Empire. The Russian imperial presence consisted of a garrison, a detachment of cavalry, an Orthodox cathedral of recent construction, a small administration of clerks and copyists, presided over by a governor with a staff, retinue, and carriage. The Russians had done little to alter Riga's old identity as a Hanseatic trading town, with German as the language of culture and commerce. There was a bourse, largely controlled by German-speaking merchants, and a Corinthian Deutsche Oper. Young Wagner had been chief d'orchestra in Riga in the 1850s, and Bruno Walter had begun his conducting career there in 1900. In the Riga of 1909, Russian was the language of administration, but the number of Russians in the city was small, and the language one would have heard in the streets, besides German, would have been Latvian and Yiddish. At the top of the social pyramid of Tsarist Riga were the Baltic barons, Russian-speaking Germans, the Kovs and the Beckendorfs, Kieserlings and the Badburgers. Family dynasties built on service to Peter the Great and to succeeding Tsars. They owned the great estate of the region and the grand house of the town. Beneath them came the German merchants of the bourse and the foreign timber traders. Next came the Jewish merchants and the Jewish professional classes. Beneath them came the Jewish artisans who lived in the Red Divina ghetto. At the bottom were the Latvians, recently unbanished country people with a peasant culture. They represented the majority, yet were disfranchised in their own land. In Riga, they were domestic servants, laborers, and governesses. Albert Street was in New Riga, across the river from the cobbled streets of the Hanseatic Old Town, in the development of Art Nouveau apartment houses in the Paris style. Sergei Einstein's father, a converted Riga Jew, had designed some of these blocks, and Einstein himself spent his early years in Riga. There were Jewish schools in the New Riga district, but it was not especially or even exclusively Jewish neighborhood. Riga lay outside the pale of settlement, the area of the western and Polish provinces of the Russian Empire, where Jews had been confined by statute since the partisans of Poland at the end of the 18th century. As long as they stayed put. Riga Jews were exempt from the humiliating restrictions of a Tsarist rule, the laws forbidding them to own land, to enter certain trades, to change their names to Christian ones, the laws banning them from the gymnasium and the universities. Even when they traveled out of Riga, none of the pale restricts restrictions applied to the Berlin family. Isaiah's father was a merchant of the First Guild, a small elite, given honorary citizenship in the empire and exempted from the laws that applied to lesser Jews. They were free to travel and trade throughout the empire, while the sawmills and timber yards of Mandau Berlin's business were located in the Jewish ghetto and employed ghetto workers. For the child born in the building between the Sphinx, the ghetto remained terra incognita. In Berlin's papers, there is a manuscript, 86 pages long, written in a spidery hand in an accountant's duplicated book, dated March 1946. It is his father's call to his son to renew the connection to the family's Riga past, to the Berlins, Washnocks, and Sneersons, the rabbis, scholars, and merchant princes of Jewish Russia. I asked whether Isaiah was aware of his father's memoir. He had no recollection of it whatsoever. In photographs, Mandel Berlin appears as a small, plump, dapper man in well-tailored three-piece suits, with a tightly clipped mustache and thinning hair. In his son's recollections, he came across as a gentle, intelligent, timid man ruled by his emotional and domineering wife. A businessman who dealt in Riga timber before the revolution and afterwards in pig's bristles. The loves of his life were not Talmud or the Psalms, but his wife, his successful son, led French comedies and the operettas of Franz Lehár. While this suggests that Mandel was a assimilated European businessman who happened to be a Jew, his memoir created a different picture. It evoked piety and yearning of the pale city of Vitebsk in Tsarist Poland, where he was born in 1883. He told how his grandfather, a vague, otherworldly rabbi, used to devote all his waking hours to the study of holy books. Mendel remembered how, when he walked home from Hebrew school at night, he would detour around the local Polish Catholic church, lest his clothes brush the walls by accident. He recalled the numbering lessons in the Hebrew school, the sting of the rabbi's correction when he forgot his Hebrew letters, the long black silk craftsman and embroidered skull cap he wore in synagogue, the mournful blast of the rams born. All of this brought the traditional Jewish world closer to Mendel's beginning than his son had led me to believe. At my urging, Isaiah read his father's memoir, all very unreliable, he said sternly, as if marking a deficient undergraduate essay. Pure sentimental return to roots, he insisted. He worked up all these Jewish feelings in old age. In 1946, when Mendel composed the memoir, he was 63, nearing the end of his professional life. He had been in exile in London for 25 years. The Soviet conquest of Latvia meant that he would never see Riga again. The Holocaust had turned his past to dust. It was hardly surprising that the roots he had sunk in England should suddenly have seemed insubstantial, and that he should have attempted to salvage what he could of his deeper allegiances. His son would have none of this. Quote, he broke away from it. He was totally emancipated. didn't eat kosher, never went to synagogue, end quote. When I pointed out that his father texted him gently in a memoir for not knowing his Talmud, Isaiah shot back, "He didn't either." Jewishness may be a central fact about Berlin, but he fashioned the kind of Jew he was and resented his father's desire to define these claims on his behalf. By the time of their son's birth, the Berlins had ascended to a world far removed from the pieties of Witebsk. The distance was linguistic as well as school. In his own childhood, Berlin's father had spoken Yiddish, but he never spoke it to his son. In Albert Street, the first language was Russian, the second German. The historian Louis Namier once compared Eastern European Jewry to a block of ice, which started to thaw when the rays of European enlightenment began to shine upon it. As the block melted, the streams of Jewish life, Zionist, Buddhist, secular, and religious, then flowed into the river of a bourgeois culture. The Berlins, Washnocks, and Schneersons of Riga were swept along in these currents of Jewish assimilation. Berlin's mother was a Washnock, and she grew up in an observant household in the Riga ghetto. But not even her Orthodox father was able to prevent her from receiving a European education and developing European yearnings to train as a singer, yearnings which, not fulfilling herself, she poured into her son. Berlin's father may have received a traditional Jewish education in the Hebrew schools of Witebsk, but as a teenager he moved to Riga, entered the gymnasium, and secured the secular German education of his time. Then he was taken into his great-uncle's timber concern, where the languages of business were German and Russian. Soon he was traveling to Paris, London, Berlin. Isaiah claimed that to be secular and skeptical as he was required no break with the family past. Yet consider these details from his father's memoir, how in 1904, traveling on the night train from Paris to Menton, Mendel and his uncle put on their prayer shawls and performed their devotions while the Gentiles slept. Of this, once a year Mendel Berlin journeyed to Lubavitch, a small village in the Smolensk gubernia of western Russia, to consult the rabbi on business matters and seek his blessing. It seems odd, a figure in a business suit queuing outside a country synagogue alongside poor folk in need of comfort and advice. The oracle in question was no ordinary rabbi. He was the leader of one of the most important sects of Hasidic Jews in Eastern Europe, known as Lubavitch, after the small settled town in eastern Poland, where the sect's religious leader came to live. Established in the 1780s by Rabbi Schuner Zerman Schunison, the Ludovitcher were among the most mystical and devout of the Hasidic sects. The Hasidim sought renewal of old institutionalized faith through singing, dancing, and other forms of a direct and joyous communion with God. The Lubavitcher and other Hasidim were fiercely resisted within traditional Jewish orthodoxy for their focus on individual's personal relationship with God and his fellow man rather than on the intricacies of Jewish law, and for the extraordinary power and the greatness attributed to their leaders. Isaiah's adoptive paternal grandmother was a Sneer son, a lineal descendant of the sex founder. From birth, therefore, he belonged to Hasidim's royal family. In the annual pilgrimage to Lubavitch, Berlin would have been received with honor. Mendel Berlin's memoir took obvious pride in these Hasidic forebears. The son was more skeptical. Origins, he always said, are a fact, full stop, but nothing to be proud of. To take pride was to surrender to the dubious determinism of the blood. Mendel used to attribute his son's memory and scholarly achievements to his rabbinical ancestors. Berlin thought this was absurd. As for the modern Lubavitch Hasidim, which their three-quarter length black frock coats, wide-brimmed hats, beards, and wranglers, he regarded them as alarming fanatics. Any mention of the Lubavitch Hasidim, locked in violent conflict with the black population of Brooklyn, or giving their support to an intransigent struggle with the Palestinians over Hebron, would cause his face to tighten into a rare and uncharacteristic expression of dislike. Yet Rabbi Schneekson, their religious leader, was a cousin. The name Isaiah was given him by his parents as a mark of respect to his adoptive great-grandfather. This man, a grand merchant prince and a member of the Lubavitch sect, was born in Vitebsk but moved to Riga as a young man in order to escape the pale restrictions on Jewish business. He married Chiata Sneerson, one of the daughters of the Zimak Zadok, then the leader of the Lubavitch. Marriage into the royal Lubavitch line gave Isaiah Sr. access to formidable networks of business and economic intelligence. Like any oracle, the rabbi was both the recipient and the dispenser of useful confidential information. Isaiah Berlin Sr., or Shai, as he was known, was thus a complex mixture of ancient piety and modern capitalist acumen. He set up in business supplying railroad ties and pit probes for German and Russian industry. By the 1890s, he owned 75,000 acres of forest land in broad swaths on either side of the river Dvina, stretching back into the pale lands around Adrianople. In these forests, Jewish timber cutters felled the pines, assembled them into rafts, and pulled them down the Dvina to the port of Riga, where Shai Berlin's sawmills in the Riga ghetto turned them into lumber for shipment to St. Petersburg, Hamburg, and London. By the turn of the century, his sawmills and forests employed several hundred workers, most of them Jews. Before Shai Berlin's time, Baltic Germans controlled the export trade. Jews generally lacked the languages and the culture necessary for such in foreign commerce. It was this most pious Hasid who made the breakthrough by taking Isaiah's father into the business and making him his chief negotiator in the European trade. Since he had no children of his own, he brought the 15-year-old Mendel, who was actually his great-nephew from West Basque, and enrolled him in the German gymnasium. When he showed promise, Shai took him into the business, adopted Mendel's father, Devaboha Jacoman, as his son, and Mendel as his grandson, and they changed their names to Berlin. By the turn of the century, Shai's timber business was so substantial that he had been made a merchant of the First Guild and granted ordinary citizenship of the Russian Empire to be passed on to his heirs. Every morning, the Russian governor would send a messenger to inquire after his well-being, and in the afternoon, Berlin's beadle was dispatched from the sawmill to reciprocate. The old merchant rose early, toured his mills in a coach and pair, visited the exchange to gossip with his Gentile colleagues, lunched, napped in his flat about the mills, and then descended to the office in the afternoon to write letters and tell stories to his entourage. Evenings were spent in restaurants and clubs. He was soon wealthy enough to afford a royal progress through the spas and resorts of Europe every winter and spring, accompanied by rabbis, kosher butchers, accountants, and by Mendel, then in his early 20s. In Menton, the old man dined and drank and enjoyed himself, on holiday from self-denial. Mendel passed the time reading Russian literature forbidden. In the Empire, Tolstoy's banned works and the leaflets of the Russian Social Democrats, while the old man's wife, Chaita, languished upstairs in the vast drawing room, singing quietly in a minor key. She spent Passover in Bad Homburg, dining in the local kosher restaurant, then talking business in the cafes and the pump rooms with the Gentile businessmen. In a mixture of Yiddish and German, he attended a synagogue in Frankfurt, where the Jews were so ostentatiously pious. Mendel noticed that, not wishing to infringe the prohibition against labor on the Sabbath, they employed a Gentile as the entrance to open and shut their umbrellas. Back on Riga, all Shai's employees had to attend his private synagogue on the Sabbath, and the master's beadle would also appear as Albert Street, bidding the family to its devotions. He was a hard paternalist of the old school. Under the old man's eye, Mendel rose to become the head of the Shai's export business. He also began courting Mosa Marie Wozniak, his first cousin, daughter of a strict Hasid. Isaac Solomon's Wozniak, also employed in the Berlin timber business. Mosa Marie was a diminutive, dark-haired, plump woman whose defining features were inexhaustible vitality, a fine singing voice, and a passionate, cleaning temperament. While still a teenager, Mendel came courting, sometimes staying the night at her house and sleeping on a pair of chairs in the downstairs salon. She turned down his first proposal for marriage, to Mendel's consternation, horror, and also shame. When, several months later, she changed her mind and accepted him at last, he felt certain, as he sadly confessed in the memoir, that mother accepted me only after calculating that she has after all to get married and she might do worse than accepting me. He knew he was timid and not good looking, but he had prospects as a showy Berlin's hair, and he evidently doted on her. The wedding took place in Riga on 13th March 1906. She was 26. He was 23. With marriage, a new apartment in Albert Street, and additional income as an insurance agent for a London company, Mendel entered the happiest period of his life, but he also began to resent his adoptive grandfather's tyrannies. The old man thought nothing of summoning his grandson by telegram in the middle of the night to German spa towns simply to translate a business letter. Now that Mendel had a family, he disliked being at Shoei's beck and call. But his period of servitude was coming to an end. In 1908, the old man died at the age of 67, leaving Mendel the business, which he promptly sold to start a new timber partnership of his own. When Isaiah was born the next year, and named after the departed patriarch, he came to the world at the highest point of his family's fortunes. Mendel quickly became head of the Riga Association of Timber Merchants and built up his volume of business with the London timber market. The young Isaiah was smothered by his doubting parents and never lost a taste for being spoiled. All his life he loved regression in all its coziest forms, taking to his bed whenever possible, preferably in a small, warmly heated rooms. At the same time, he did not believe that he was, as he put it, mother fixated. If anything, it was he who dominated them both. There is something of the young domestic tyrant in the early photographs. Isaiah's volubility, the non-stop talking, might have had its beginnings in being a preternaturally bright and bubblingly only child, sure that no one, certainly no younger sister or older brother, would interrupt his monologues. In his memory, he dominated the scene around him. He was taken to see Chayata Berlin, widow of Shoei, the founding father, sometime in 1912. The room was an overheated, dimly lit salon, immaculate, gleaming and sad, at the end of which, in an armchair, sat a yellowish old lady, the influenced Victorian widow's wreath with a kerchief on her head. His parents ushered him forward and bade him kiss her hand. She was the matriarch of the clan, and he the namesake of her dead husband. But there was something repugnant about the wrinkled old face, the darkness, the yellowed flesh. Isaiah refused. The shame of the parents was great, his victory complete. When they took their leave, the matriarch's hand had still not been kissed. He never saw her again. In another early memory, he also played the infant tyrant. In 1912, his father's sister, Evangenia, married Isaac Landelberg, a dashing adventurer, one-time boxer, gallery owner, and man about town. Isaiah, aged 3, was taken to the wedding reception in a white silk suit. A dance band is playing. The couples swirl around him. He is placed on a table, exhibited to aunts and uncles, chucked under the chin, made a spectacle of. Someone is holding him up. The dancers swirl around him. The music goes louder and louder. Suddenly he is shouting in infantile fury. Each has death Sesmosk. He stamps his foot at the sheet music, and the adult would stop dancing. Apart from these grand occasions, the Berlins lived quietly. They took family holidays at the Baltic resorts and winter cures at the German spas. But the general impression of their life in the Albert Street flat is of a family turned in upon the child at its center. In a letter written to the psychiatrist Anthony Starr in 1978, Berlin himself pondered why it was that, having received a full measure of parental love at all times, he should have been plagued all his life with the feeling that his achievements were of very little or of no value. Certainly his works as a warning against deducing the adult from the child, yet the self-doubt of which he speaks, however real it sometimes was also part of a carefully cultivated strategy of self-deprecation, intended to deflect and disarm criticism. Beneath this exterior, there was a quiet and unshakable sense of self-worth. It cannot be irrelevant that he began life in front of an audience of two worshipping, overawed parents. That's the end of the second chapter.